wind carried the scent of dust and juniper across the high plains of West Texas, as golden dusk settled over the land like a fading hymn. It was late October of 1879, and Margaret Callahan crouched by the fire in her modest cabin, tucking a handful of kindling beneath the embers. The logs popped softly in the hearth as the wind hissed through the shutters. She wore her late husband's flannel shirt over her dress, the sleeves rolled high. Her hands cracked from chopping wood that morning. Her body moved on instinct, but her heart felt hollow. A year had passed since she buried Thomas out behind the cottonwoods, and in all that time, no one had come up the trail until now. A knock shattered the silence, sharp, urgent, then another louder, desperate. Margaret froze, her hand still above the flame. She rose slowly, her breath caught in her chest, and reached for the rifle leaning by the door. But before she could lift it, a voice came through the wood. Broken English, strained. "Please, milk, my son. He is dying." Margaret hesitated, then she unbarred the door. Standing before her was a tall Apache man, hair tied back with a strip of leather, his shoulders wrapped in a battered wool blanket. In his arms, swaddled in a threadbare cloth, was a baby barely more than a bundle of bones and soft breath. The child's lips were dry, his skin pale, his chest rising in fragile flutters. Behind the man, a few townsfolk had gathered in the dim light, whispering and holding lanterns as if to cast out demons. "It's an Apache," one woman hissed. "Shut the door. Maggie, don't let him in." Margaret didn't move, her eyes fixed on the baby. She could see each rib beneath the thin cloth, could hear the rasp in the boy's breath. She stepped forward. "Give him to me," she said, her voice steady. The warrior hesitated. "He needs milk," he said again. "No more time. I have milk," she said. "He won't make it out here." He handed the baby over so carefully it broke something open inside her. She brought the child into the warmth and sat by the fire. Her fingers trembled as she unbuttoned her blouse and guided the baby's tiny mouth to her breast. At first, nothing. Then a weak latch. The infant suckled slowly, breaths becoming softer, less frantic. Margaret bowed her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. The Apache man stayed just inside the doorway, unmoving, his eyes locked on the child. The firelight revealed a wound crusted over near his collarbone. Margaret saw the pain in his face, but also the terror of a father about to lose his only son. "You saved him," the man whispered. She didn't answer. She cradled the child close, feeling the rhythm of his breath against her skin. "What's his name?" she asked quietly. The man looked away. "His mother named him Kahi. We do not speak her name since she passed." Margaret nodded, her throat tightening. Outside, the wind slammed against the shutters. The murmurs of the townsfolk grew louder. Margaret rose slowly, the baby still nestled against her. She opened the door again and faced the crowd. "He's a child," she said firmly, "and no child starves on my porch." The crowd didn't answer, but one by one, they turned their lanterns away. Back inside, the man removed a leather cord from around his neck. From it hung a red-tailed hawk feather, wide and dark-tipped. He held it out. "In my people's ways," he said. "This means protection. For those who give life." Margaret hesitated, then took it, laying it beside the boy. The fire cracked. The child slept, and a quiet understanding settled between them. They said nothing more that night, but something had begun, something neither war nor winter could undo. Each morning after that, just as the sun touched the edge of the mesa, the warrior returned with the child. He never stepped inside unless invited. Margaret fed the baby by the fire, her arms already accustomed to his weight. His name, she decided, was Nathaniel, a gift from God. And though the warrior whose name she learned was Jolin said little, he always watched her with a quiet reverence, as though witnessing something sacred. One morning, Margaret handed Jolin a cloth bundle of cornbread and dried beans. "For the trail," she said. He looked down at it. "You don't owe me anything. I give because he's hungry," she replied. "And so are you." Jolon nodded, then glanced at the makeshift cradle she had carved from a dresser drawer. The boy slept in peace now, his breath strong, his cheeks full. When Jolon left, Margaret stood at the window, watching, beneath the cottonwoods. She saw him stop, glance back, and touch 2 fingers to his brow in quiet thanks. By the end of the month, Margaret found a tiny wooden horse carved from cedar on the cradle. Its shape was rough, but it stood steady, like the man who carved it. That night, she wrapped it in a soft cloth and placed it in the baby's hand. But peace never stayed long in places like Lone Mesa. News of the Apache man visiting a white widow spread through town like wildfire. One afternoon, 4 men arrived at her door, guns at their sides and words soaked in fear. "That boy don't belong here," one of them said. "We heard you been feeding him." "I have," Margaret answered, "and I'll keep doing so." Jolon arrived before the situation could erupt. He stood beside her, not ahead of her, not behind. When the men threatened to take the boy, Jolon placed a hand on his chest. "This is his mother," he said, motioning to Margaret. "And I am his father. He stays." The men hesitated, then backed away. Unwilling to spark a fight they weren't sure they'd win. That winter, snow blanketed the mesa. Jolon brought food from his tribe. Margaret taught Nathaniel to grasp her finger. They watched the sun set together in silence, 2 souls who'd known loss but had found something stronger in each other. Spring brought a letter, an invitation from a circuit preacher to wed under the open sky. Lanterns hung from cottonwoods, and Margaret wore a simple blue dress. Jolon took her hands and said, "Not because I saved you, not because you fed my son, but because I choose you." She answered, "And I you." They built a schoolhouse beside the cabin where settler and Apache children learned side by side. In time, Nathaniel took his first steps on that same wooden floor. Above the hearth, carved into a plank, were 3 names: Margaret, Jolon, Nathaniel. A family, chosen, not inherited, not owed, just real. And in the stillness of that home, they proved that love, not blood, is what holds people together. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting a soft orange glow over the walls of the cabin as the chill of the evening crept in. Rachel Monroe sat still on the edge of the rocking chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as though trying to anchor herself in the moment. Outside, the wind rustled the mesquite branches and carried with it the murmurs of voices, sharp, suspicious, full of unease. She had seen them out there through the slats of the window. Townsfolk gathering near the edge of her land, whispering among themselves, holding lanterns high as if to ward off shadows. But she didn't move. Not yet. Her eyes were fixed on the baby in her arms. He was small, far too small, with skin the color of warm sand and lips cracked from thirst. The cloth he was wrapped in was threadbare and barely warm. His breathing had been faint when the Apache warrior placed him in her arms, his voice breaking as he asked for help. For milk. Rachel had hesitated only a second. Then she brought the child inside. And now here she was, seated by the fire with the baby nestled against her chest, feeding slowly, the tension in his tiny limbs easing with every swallow. She hadn't breastfed since her daughter died 2 winters ago. After Mary passed, her milk had dried along with her spirit, but somehow, the moment the baby's cheek brushed her skin, warmth stirred in her again, not just in her body but in her soul. A quiet sense of purpose took root, fragile but real. She supported the infant with one arm and held a warm blanket around his back, protecting him from the cold that clung to the corners of the cabin. The fire was the only witness to this moment, but she knew it mattered. Behind her, just inside the door, stood the baby's father, Elon, an Apache warrior with eyes dark as midnight and a scar that ran across his temple like a wound that never healed. He said little, only watching. There was tension in his stance, as though he expected her to change her mind, to hand the baby back and send them away. But Rachel didn't. She rocked slowly, gently, humming the same tune she used to sing to her daughter on stormy nights. The baby's eyes fluttered closed. He was full, Warm, safe. The silence stretched long, broken only by the crackling of the logs and the creak of wood beneath the rocking chair. Then Elon stepped forward, slow, careful. His voice was low when he spoke. "You did not have to do this." "I know," Rachel replied, her voice just above a whisper, "but I chose to." He looked at her for a long moment, then at the child, and finally lowered himself to the floor near the fire. There was a gentleness in his movements, even in his silence, as though he was afraid that speaking too loud would shatter the moment. Rachel could feel it, too, that this was something delicate, suspended between two people who had every reason to mistrust one another but chose instead to meet halfway. "They won't understand," he said softly, nodding toward the window. "They never do," she answered. "But that doesn't mean it's wrong." Outside, the murmuring grew louder. Someone knocked once, sharp and impatient. Rachel didn't move. The baby stirred in her arms, then settled again. Elon looked toward the door but didn't rise. "I'll handle it," Rachel said. She stood slowly, cradling the child in one arm, and walked to the door. When she opened it, the faces of half a dozen townsfolk stared back at her tight-lipped. Eyes narrowed, judgment heavy in the air. One man stepped forward. "Mr. Carlyle, the butcher's son." He pointed at the child. "You can't be serious. Rachel, that baby's not yours, and he's not welcome here." Rachel didn't flinch. "He's hungry. That's what matters." Mrs. Whitcomb, older and thinner than last year, tightened her shawl around her shoulders. "We know what those people have done, their kind, his kind." Rachel interrupted, her voice rising. "You mean fathers desperate to keep their children alive. You mean men who ask for help instead of stealing it." Carlyle stepped closer. "You're putting yourself in danger." "No," Rachel said, on quiet but firm. "I'm choosing to do what's right." They stared at her, unsure, angry, and yet unwilling to cross the line she had drawn so clearly. After a long pause, the group began to retreat, one by one, disappearing into the cold. She closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding. The baby whimpered softly, and she soothed him with gentle fingers. When she turned around, Elon was standing now, his expression unreadable. He looked down at the child in her arms and said, "You are not afraid." "I'm terrified," she admitted, "but not of you, not of him." He took a slow breath, then reached into the folds of his coat. From it, he pulled a small pouch made of hide, worn smooth by years of use. Inside was a carved stone, a talisman in the shape of a mother holding a child. He placed it on the mantel without a word. Rachel looked at it, then at him. "Thank you." She would have been grateful, Elon said. "His mother." Rachel nodded, not trusting herself to speak. That night, the three of them remained by the fire. Elon didn't ask to stay, and Rachel didn't offer. But when the baby cried again, she held him close without hesitation. When the fire burned low, she added more logs, and when the wind howled outside, she hummed until it passed. The next morning, she found a small feather placed gently on the windowsill, clean, unbroken, and white-tipped, a gift, a sign. She didn't ask questions. She simply tucked it beside the talisman on the mantel. Over the following weeks, Elon came each evening with the child. He never entered unless invited. Rachel fed the baby, and in the quiet moments, they spoke not of war, not of grief, but of small things. The land, the weather, what the baby liked. Elon began bringing food: venison, dried fruit, cornmeal. One day he left a small wooden toy carved into the shape of a bird. Another day, a blanket embroidered with symbols Rachel didn't recognize but instinctively understood. In time, Rachel stopped thinking of the child as someone else's. She named him Samuel. He laughed in her arms. He knew her voice. He reached for her hand, and though she never said it aloud, she began to feel something bloom inside her, something tender, familiar, terrifying. One night, as they sat together beside the fire, Elon spoke. "I have no tribe left," he said. "They're gone. But this feels like home." Rachel turned toward him. It does to me, too. And when the baby reached out and grasped both of their fingers at once, neither pulled away. The wind carried voices across the dry fields that bordered Clara Henderson's homestead, whispers weaving between cornstalks and fence posts, reaching even the cracks beneath her door. It began the very next morning after she brought the baby into her home. At first, it was just murmurs, idle talk in the general store, sideways glances at the well pump, heads turning in church pews when she walked in alone. But by week's end, the whispering turned to words, and the words turned to judgment. The townspeople of Elmbrook were not subtle when they disapproved, and they did not approve of Clara's decision. She had taken in an Apache child, a boy whose father had come to her door at dusk, pleading not for shelter, not for charity, but simply for milk. She had looked into that man's eyes, Elan. His name was, and she saw the truth of desperation, the honesty of a father trying to keep his son alive. And without asking another soul, she let them in. Now, each time she walked to town, she felt the weight of eyes on her back, not curious but accusing. They didn't see a woman saving a child, they saw a woman crossing a line, as if compassion came with conditions. At the mercantile, old Mr. Griggs refused to meet her gaze when she handed him coin for flour. At the church, the preacher stumbled when he greeted her, then quickly moved on. Even her neighbor Alma, who once brought her buttermilk and stories, now kept to her own porch. Clara didn't confront them. She wasn't one for dramatics. She kept her chin up and walked with quiet resolve, just as she had when her husband died, just as she had when the drought took the crops. But it stung how quickly kindness turned to suspicion when it didn't fit the mold they were used to. What they didn't see was how Samuel she had named the child herself thrived under her care. His color returned, his limbs filled out, and his giggle came in hiccuping bursts when she ran her fingers along his belly. He reached for her hair, for her voice, for her face. He cried at night unless her arms held him. And when he slept, it was with one hand tangled in the hem of her blouse, like an anchor. Elan came often, but he never stayed too long. He would bring dried venison, woven blankets, and once a handmade rattle carved from mesquite. Sometimes he sat on the porch while she fed Samuel, watching the sky, saying little. But in the quiet, Clara felt a steadiness from him, as if together they were building something neither had words for. That all shifted the morning 5 riders appeared at the edge of her land. Clara had just laid Samuel in his crib, the fire still glowing with morning heat. When she heard the hooves, she stepped onto her porch and saw them lined up. 4 men and a deputy, with their hats low and hands near their belts. At their center was Levi Caldwell, a rancher known more for loud words than wise ones. His coat was dusted with trail dirt, his voice already raised. "We need to talk, Clara." She stood tall, then talk. "We've let this slide long enough," Levi said. "You've brought trouble to this town. Feeding that baby's one thing, but keeping him, raising him like your own, that ain't natural. It ain't right." Clara crossed her arms. "He's a child. Levi, he was dying. I did what any decent person should have. That ain't what this is about. You're sending a message, taking sides, making us look like fools. You think we're gonna just stand by while you bring wild blood into town." Elin stepped from the side of the cabin, then, silent as ever, appearing from the line of pines near the barn. He didn't speak. He didn't raise his hands, but his presence alone made Levi shift in the saddle. Elan's eyes were calm, but there was no mistaking the resolve behind them. Levi looked between Clara and Elin. "You planning to make a family of this?" Clara didn't hesitate. "I already have." That seemed to crack something in the air. One of the other men, Robert Teague, a younger ranch hand, spat in the dirt, muttering something about disgrace. Another leaned down and said, "We should let the law decide." But the deputy didn't move. His name was Garland, and though he said little, he'd lived long enough to recognize when men were pushing a line they shouldn't cross. He looked at Clara, then at Samuel's crib visible through the cabin window, and finally at Levi. "This woman's broken no law," he said. You don't like her choices, fine. But this isn't your land, Levi. And it ain't your child. Levi cursed under his breath, jerking his reins. You'll regret this. Clara, you and your strays. She didn't flinch. I regret only that it took this long for someone to care. They rode off, dust kicking up behind them, leaving silence and tension in their wake. Clara remained on the porch, arms at her sides, watching them disappear. Elon came to stand beside her, the heat of him steady and close. They'll come again, he said. She nodded. Let them. Inside. Samuel stirred and Clara turned. She lifted him from the crib, pressed her cheek to his, felt his warmth, his breath, his trust. They don't decide who I am, she whispered to him, and they don't decide who you'll become. That evening, when Elon rose to leave, he paused at the door. You don't have to carry this alone, he said. Clara looked at him. I'm not anymore. She watched him disappear into the trees, his silhouette swallowed by dusk. She stayed on the porch until the stars appeared, listening to the crickets, to the wind brushing through grass, and to the baby breathing softly against her shoulder. Whatever storm might come next, she knew this. She would face it the same way she had faced everything else, with quiet strength, an open door, and a heart willing to fight for what it had found. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grass as Clara stepped out onto the porch with Samuel nestled in her arms. Still warm from sleep, the air held the soft scent of dew and earth. And for a moment everything felt still. She hadn't seen Elon since the men rode out of her land 3 days ago. She knew he wouldn't vanish. Not completely. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke in quiet ways that others often missed. That was how he entered her life, not with declarations, but with presence. And now, as she stood swaying slowly with the baby, she saw him again. He came from the tree line, moving like the wind, quiet, certain. His hair was tied back, his expression as unreadable as ever. In one hand, he held something small, wrapped in a strip of cloth. When he reached the porch, he said nothing at first. Clara stepped aside without needing to ask, allowing him space on the top step. She sat in the rocking chair and watched as he knelt, unwrapping the cloth slowly to reveal a single feather. It was long, white-tipped, clean despite the dust of the trail. He held it out to her without ceremony. For him, he said, glancing at the child. And for you. Clara took it carefully, turning it over in her hand. It was smooth and delicate but carried a quiet strength. She could sense its meaning: life, protection, endurance. Thank you, she whispered. Elon only nodded. Then he stood, stepping back as Samuel stirred in her arms and gave a small grunt of waking. She settled the child more securely, brushing a finger along his cheek. Elon stayed a while longer that morning, silent as always. He didn't ask to hold the child, no, he didn't try to speak the things that lived behind his eyes. But when he left the feather behind, placed gently on the windowsill beside the cradle. The days passed, and though Elon didn't return every day, Clara began to feel his presence in ways that had little to do with being seen. One morning, a wrapped bundle of roots and herbs was found at her door, medicine for colic, or so she assumed. Another evening, just as the light began to fade, she heard the soft thump of something left on her porch. When she stepped outside, she found a small wooden horse, roughly carved but clearly shaped with care. Its legs were sturdy, its back smooth, and its head tilted as though it were mid-gallop. She picked it up, her chest tightening with emotion. She placed it in Samuel's crib the same night, and when he reached for it with chubby fingers, she smiled. It wasn't a grand gift. It wasn't about impressing. It was about seeing, understanding, meeting another soul without words. Sometimes, Clara would find herself sitting on the porch long after Samuel had fallen asleep, the child's gentle breaths audible through the open window. She would rock slowly, watching the horizon, hoping Elon might appear from the trees. Even when he didn't, she would still feel him near, like a whisper carried by the land itself. One evening, as a thunderstorm rolled low in the distance, Clara lit a lantern and waited. The clouds crackled with heat, and the baby slept soundly despite the rumbles overhead. Ilan arrived just before the rain began, his shoulders damp, his eyes reflecting the firelight inside the cabin. She gestured for him to come in. He hesitated, then stepped across the threshold for the first time. Inside, the air was warm and filled with the scent of wood smoke and fresh bread. Ilan looked around, taking in the small room, the carefully arranged jars on the shelf, the folded blankets, the cradle where Samuel now slept with the wooden horse tucked beneath his arm. He sat on the floor near the hearth, not far from where Clara took her place in the rocking chair. For a long time, they said nothing. The only sound was the rain tapping against the windows and the occasional low groan of thunder. Then Ilan spoke, his voice soft, shaped by memory. "My wife," she sang to him once, when he was still inside her. Every night, a different song. Clara looked at him, her hands resting in her lap. "What happened to her fever?" he said. "She lived long enough to hold him. Then she was gone." She swallowed, the lump in her throat rising. "I'm sorry." He nodded. "You lost someone too." "My daughter," Clara said quietly. "She was only 3. I thought I couldn't hold another child again. I thought it would tear me apart." Ilan glanced toward the cradle. "But you did." "I did," she said, her voice thick. "And I'm still here." They sat like that through the storm, 2 people carved by grief, held together by a child who had no idea the weight he had carried into their lives. There was no need to speak more. The bond between them didn't grow through conversation. It grew in moments like these: shared silence, pain acknowledged, kindness offered without expectation. When the storm passed and Ilan rose to leave, Clara walked him to the door. He paused there, turning to face her. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will bring him something else." What she asked, curious. "A name," he replied. Then he was gone, stepping into the night as quietly as he had arrived. The next day, just as promised, Ilan returned with a name. He knelt by the cradle and placed a small beaded necklace near the baby's pillow and said, "Tayen." It means new moon rising. Clara repeated it softly, "Tayen." Samuel Tayen Henderson. The name sat on her tongue like a blessing. From then on, the boy had 2 names, 2 beginnings, and 2 people who claimed him not by blood, but by choice. Clara and Ilan never said what they were to each other, not in the words others might use. But it was understood, in the way she passed him the baby without hesitation, in the way he left an extra blanket when frost came early, in the way he carved a spoon for Samuel's first bite of mashed beans and watched, grinning faintly as the baby rejected it with a grimace. It was not a loud love, nor a dramatic one. It was quiet and deliberate, a bond forged from loss, stitched with kindness, sealed with the kind of trust that only those who've endured silence and sorrow can truly give. And one night, when Clara looked across the fire and saw Ilan gently rocking Samuel with the carved horse in his lap, she realized something simple, powerful, and true. They weren't building toward a life together. They already had one. The early frost of November crept in without warning, laying a pale shimmer over the pastures that surrounded Clara's small homestead. The air was sharp and dry, the sky brittle with gray. Inside, the cabin was warm, filled with the quiet hum of daily life. The scent of stew lingered from lunch, and baby Samuel slept soundly in his cradle, one hand curled around the wooden horse Ilan had carved for him. Clara moved through the space with practiced ease, straightening the blanket, adding another log to the fire, her ears always attuned to the soft rhythm of the child's breath. The quiet didn't last. It started with hooves slow at first, then growing louder, the cadence familiar and heavy with intention. Clara stepped onto the porch and saw them, 6 men riding in tight formation, led again by Levi Caldwell. Behind them, 2 others carried rifles, and one wore the tin badge of a deputy. But this wasn't the same Garland who had stood for her weeks earlier. This man was younger, unfamiliar, and already scowling. Clara's heart pounded, but her hands remained steady. She didn't reach for the shotgun near the door. Not yet. Levi pulled his horse up short, dust circling his boots. We gave you time. Clara, you could have done the decent thing. Could have handed that baby over to the proper authorities. But you didn't. She met his gaze, unblinking. What authority is that? The one that lets a child die because of where he was born? Or the one that pretends to protect while standing by in silence? You're making this worse than it needs to be. Levi growled. That baby ain't yours. You've no right to keep him. I have every right to love him, she said, her voice quiet but firm. At that moment, Elon appeared from around the side of the cabin. He hadn't come with horses. He hadn't brought weapons. Just himself. He stepped forward with the calm of a man who had faced worse than what stood before him. His eyes moved across the men, reading them like one might read the shifting winds. The deputy nudged his horse forward. You're harboring a fugitive, Miss Henderson. No, Clara said. I'm raising a child. Levi dismounted, walking slowly toward the porch. You need to understand something. This town's got rules. We don't just let strangers claim what ain't theirs. You take him in. What happens next? You marry this man, you build a life like none of this matters. I don't owe you an explanation, Clara said. You owe this town your loyalty, he snapped. And right now, you've turned your back on all of us. She stood her ground. If loyalty means turning away from a child in need, then I've chosen a different kind of loyalty. Elon stepped forward then, placing himself between Clara and the men. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't speak immediately. His silence was its own kind of power. The men shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. Finally, Elon spoke. He is my son. His mother died bringing him into this world. Clara saved him when no one else would. She nursed him, comforted him, gave him warmth when there was only cold. You see the skin on my face and think you know everything. But this woman, she is his mother. There was a pause, thick with tension. Elon looked toward Clara, then back to the men. And I am his father. Levi scoffed. You think saying it makes it true? I don't need you to believe it. Elon replied. It's true whether you do or not. The deputy raised his rifle a hair. Uncertain. We could arrest you both. There's laws about this. Which law? Clara asked. The one that protects children or the one that punishes compassion? The man didn't answer. From inside the cabin, Samuel began to cry. Clara turned to go to him, but before she could, Levi lunged forward, grabbing her by the arm. The motion was fast, fueled by frustration more than strategy. Elon reacted without violence, just swift and precise. He stepped between them, forcing Levi back with nothing more than a firm shove and a warning glare. His hands remained open, no weapon, just strength and intent. Don't, Elon said. That's the only warning you get. Levi stumbled, regaining his footing but not his confidence. The moment stretched long. The other men looked to one another, unsure, waiting for someone to lead. But Levi's confidence had cracked, and the deputy wasn't prepared for what had just unfolded. No one reached for a weapon. No one made a move toward the cabin. Clara walked inside and returned moments later with Samuel in her arms. The child's cheeks were red from crying, but he quieted as soon as he felt her touch. She stood on the porch, facing them all with the baby resting against her chest. You want to know what I'm building here, she said. It's not rebellion. It's not defiance. It's a family. One built not on blood, but on love and choice and courage. And if that threatens you, then I suggest you look at yourselves, not at me. Elon stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on the porch rail, his presence like a wall behind her. No one spoke. The silence was no longer full of threat, but of recognition that they would not win here. Not today. Levi mounted his horse again, muttering curses under his breath. The others followed suit, some looking back, most not. As they rode away, the sound of their retreat was quieter than when they arrived, like a storm that had lost its thunder. When the last rider disappeared over the ridge, Clara let out a slow breath. Her knees trembled, but her heart was steady. Samuel reached up and touched her chin, as if sensing her strength and drawing from it. Elon turned to her. "They will talk. They already do," she said with a faint smile. "Let them." That night, Elon remained longer than usual. They ate quietly, and when Samuel fell asleep between them, Elon placed the child gently in the cradle. Clara watched him. The way his fingers lingered just long enough to show tenderness, she stepped beside him, resting her hand on his arm. "You meant what you said," she whispered. "I did," he replied, and so did she. There was no need for ceremony, no witness but the fire and the wind outside. But in that small, defiant home, the line had been drawn not in anger or blood, but in the unwavering bond between two souls who refused to let fear decide the shape of their family. Morning sunlight spilled through the cabin windows, casting golden rays across the floorboards where Clara stood barefoot, a carving knife in her hand and quiet focus in her eyes. The soft coos of the baby drifted from the cradle behind her, where little Samuel lay swaddled in a quilt she'd pieced together from scraps of her old dresses and her late husband's shirts. Her hands moved with slow intention, smoothing the wood above the cradle's arch. She had sanded the space clean the day before, knowing this moment had been coming. Though she hadn't spoken it aloud, not even to Elon, the baby's name was already carved in her heart. She had whispered it to him in the quiet hours when the world outside felt sharp and cruel, had sung it low when the child stirred in his sleep. But now it was time to give it place, to make it visible, to declare it not just to herself but to the home and to the land that held them. The knife moved in practiced lines, forming each letter Samuel. Beneath it, she etched a smaller word, Tayen, the name Elon had given him in his language, meaning new moon rising. Two names, two beginnings, bound together. As she worked, memories moved through her like a slow wind. The first knock at her door, the tiny hands reaching for her hair, the fear in Elon's eyes when he asked for help, the judgment of the town, the threats they had stood against, the fire that had kept them warm. All of it brought them to this morning, this moment. When she finished, she stepped back and looked at the carving. The letters were not perfect, but they were strong and permanent. A declaration carved not in stone or paper, but in the heart of the place where Samuel slept. She bent low and kissed the edge of the wood, sealing it with a silent promise. Elon arrived just before noon. She heard the soft crunch of his boots on the gravel path and opened the door before he could knock. He smiled faintly, eyes soft beneath the shadow of his hat. Over one shoulder hung a woven satchel, and in his hand, he held a small bundle wrapped in animal hide. "I brought something," he said, stepping inside. Clara closed the door behind him, the scent of cedar and smoke rising off his coat. He moved quietly, his presence never demanding, never rushed. He looked toward the cradle where Samuel slept, his gaze lingering on the baby's face before shifting to the wood above. He walked closer, running his fingers gently along the name carved there. She watched as his thumb traced each letter with reverence. "You gave him both names," he said softly. "He belongs to both of us," Clara replied. "He always has." Elon turned then and unwrapped the bundle he carried. Inside was a necklace, delicate but rich with meaning. Beads of bone and turquoise, polished smooth, were strung between tiny feathers and hand-carved shapes: a turtle, a sprouting seed, a small sun. At the center hung a carved medallion made of river stone, etched with symbols unfamiliar to her, yet resonant. He held it out to her with both hands, his eyes steady. "In my tribe, we give this to mark continuation," he said, a way of saying life moves forward, even when we think it has stopped. The turtle means protection. The seed means new beginning. Clara didn't speak at first. She stared at the necklace, overwhelmed by the beauty and weight of the gesture. Slowly, with both hands, she accepted it. The string felt warm from his palms. She held it to her chest, pressing it against the space just above her heart. "Thank you," she said, barely above a whisper. Elon stepped forward and gently placed it around her neck. His fingers brushed her skin as he fastened it. and for a moment, neither of them moved. The fire popped softly in the hearth, and outside the wind rustled through the brittle grass. In the stillness, something shifted between them, no longer just survival, no longer just gratitude, but the beginning of something neither had dared to name. Later, they sat together on the porch, Samuel asleep in Clara's arms. The carved horse rested on her lap, and the necklace caught sunlight and glints of blue and bone. They watched the sky as it stretched wide with clouds drifting like sails. Clara leaned into Elan's shoulder, feeling the rise and fall of his breath beneath the fabric of his shirt. "I used to think family was something you were born into," she said. "But now I know. Sometimes you build it, piece by piece." Elan nodded, his voice low and sure. "The strongest homes are built from choice." They sat there long after the sun dipped behind the hills, the chill settling over the porch. He took the child gently from her arms, cradling Samuel as though he'd done it 1,000 times. The baby stirred, then settled again, his cheek pressed to Elan's chest. As night fell, Clara lit the lantern inside the cabin, the warm glow spilling out through the windows, casting long shadows across the ground. She walked inside and returned with another blanket, draping it across Elan's shoulders as he held the child. Their eyes met, and for a long while, no words passed between them. They didn't need them. In that quiet, beneath the stars, the carving above the cradle seemed to glow with a light of its own, not from the fire, not from the lantern, but from something deeper, something rooted in sacrifice, in tenderness, in the quiet defiance of two people who had chosen not to let the world harden them. The names carved there weren't just letters, they were a legacy, a foundation. Clara reached for Elan's hand. He took it without hesitation. Whatever storms might come, whatever voices might rise again against them, she knew they had already found the one thing no one could take away: a place to belong, a child to protect, and a love carved into the grain of their lives like the names above that cradle, permanent, sacred and real. And the wind shifted that morning, carrying with it the kind of chill that signaled change. Clara felt it before she saw anything, before the birds went quiet, before the dogs barked at the distant tree line, before the first horses crested the hill beyond the river. She was in the garden, kneeling in damp soil, planting late-season turnips. Her hands were caked in dirt. The sleeves of her flannel rolled to her elbows, and for a moment, she thought it might be nothing. But then she stood, wiped her hands on her apron, and squinted toward the ridge. Dust rose behind the horses, and her breath caught in her chest. Not again. Inside the cabin, Elan was fixing a loose hinge on the window frame while Samuel sat on the floor beside him, stacking little stones in uneven towers and knocking them down again with happy squeals. Clara stepped inside, calm on the outside but alert in every step. Elan looked up, saw her face, and set down his tools. No words passed between them, none were needed. He stood, lifted Samuel gently into Clara's arms, and reached for his knife and bow. They had been through this once before. The threat had passed that time, but it had left scars in the town, in the air between them, and especially in the way Clara watched the horizon every morning. The townspeople had gone quiet after the last confrontation, unsure of what to do with a woman who chose love and courage over fear. But fear had a way of finding new voices. Clara stepped outside, shielding Samuel with one arm. Just as the horses reached the front gate, she recognized the first man immediately: Deputy Garland, the good one, the one who hadn't flinched when she'd stood her ground last year. But this time, he wasn't alone. Flanking him were two federal marshals, their uniforms dusty from the trail. Behind them came a surprise Mr. Abernathy, the local carpenter, and Miss June Hollis, the preacher's sister who'd once refused to sit beside Clara in church, and more neighbors, ranchers, even two of the shopkeepers from town. Not with torches, not with rifles raised, but with solemn, steady eyes. Garland stepped forward and tipped his hat. "Clara, Elan, we came to let you know what we heard." Elan stood behind Clara now, silent but present. Clara shifted Samuel to her other hip. Go on. There's a group coming up from the south, Garland said. Not townsfolk, strangers. Men claiming to be bounty hunters. But they're not following any badge I know. They heard rumors about an Apache raising a child on settler land, and they're looking to stir trouble. Clara's jaw tightened. How soon? Maybe 2 days. Garland said. Maybe less. The marshal stepped forward. We're not here to remove you or ask questions. We're here to protect you. Orders came down from Austin, and after what happened last year, they're not taking any chances to this place. What you've done here, but people are talking in the right places. Clara blinked. You mean people care? Abernathy cleared his throat. Folks noticed you didn't break, that the child's healthy, that you didn't shut the door on anyone, even when it would have been easier. Miss Hollis stepped closer, holding a stack of books tied with string. And we heard you wanted to start a school. Elan nodded. A place where Apache children and settler children learn together. And play together, Clara added. And grow without fear. The marshal looked around at the assembled group. Well, you're going to get that chance. But first, we make sure no one takes it from you. What followed was something Clara had never imagined possible. Over the next 2 days, her land became a living wall of unity. Townsfolk pitched tents, built lookout perches in the trees, dug trenches near the back pasture not for war, but for defense. Elan coordinated with the marshals, scouting paths through the forest. The townspeople brought food, tools, even quilts, and Clara, with Samuel strapped to her back, helped lay the foundation stones of something bigger than herself. The bounty hunters came at dusk on the 3rd day, rough men with hardened faces and greed in their eyes, but they found themselves facing not just a mother and a warrior, but an entire community standing side by side, armed not only with weapons, but with conviction. No shots were fired. The marshals arrested 3 of them without incident, and the rest fled into the trees, chased not by bullets but by the silent certainty that hate had no home here. When the danger passed, no one left right away. They stayed through the night, lighting lanterns and sitting by fires, telling stories. Samuel wandered between laps and was fed bites of pie by hands that had once trembled with suspicion. At sunrise, Clara stood by the carved sign that Elan had hung the day before, etched simply Tayan's schoolhouse. Below it, a carved turtle and sprouting seed. A year passed. The cabin expanded to make space for benches and bookshelves. Children arrived with bare feet and curious eyes, some pale, some brown, some carrying baskets, others riding ponies. Elan taught them how to follow animal tracks and honor the land. Clara read them letters and numbers, taught them songs and how to listen when others spoke. And Samuel, now walking, raced between them all, a living symbol of what could grow from the ashes of fear. The schoolhouse became a gathering place, not just for learning but for healing. The townspeople who once looked down on Clara came now to ask her advice. The parents who had once muttered disapproval now offered jam jars and helped repair the fence. And every evening, as the sun dipped low and cast golden light through the windows, Clara stood at the threshold and watched the children laugh and shout across the field, knowing that they were building something lasting. One night, as Elan stood beside her, the necklace he once gave her still resting at her collarbone, he asked, "Do you think it will last?" Clara turned to him, brushing her fingers across his hand. "It already has." In the land where there had once been silence and suspicion, there was now laughter, learning, and the hum of something sacred, peace earned, not given, love chosen, not inherited, and a future carved from courage, carried forward by all who believed in what they'd built together. The evening settled gently over the land, painting the horizon in shades of lavender and gold. A soft breeze moved through the tall grasses, rustling like distant whispers. Clara stood at the edge of her garden, watching as the last sliver of sun dipped below the hills. The sky above turned deeper with every breath, and the first stars began to blink into view. Lanterns, simple and hand-lit, swayed from the porch rafters, casting warm circles of light that danced across the cabin walls and wooden floor. Inside, Samuel had already fallen asleep, curled around his favorite quilt and the small wooden horse Aylin had carved. Clara watched him for a moment before stepping back out onto the porch, her hands lightly brushing the folds of her cotton dress. She didn't know what made this night feel different, only that it did. The stillness held a kind of anticipation, not heavy or nervous, just full of something waiting to be spoken. Ilan appeared from the tree line not long after dusk, walking at his usual steady pace, his silhouette outlined by the silver sheen of moonlight. He wore a clean shirt, the buttons done carefully, and a leather band wrapped around his wrist that Clara had never seen before. His presence, as always, made the air feel a little more grounded. He paused at the porch steps, meeting her eyes with quiet intention. Then, without a word, he climbed the steps and stood beside her beneath the lanterns. She could smell cedar and smoke and the faint sweetness of wild mint. The silence stretched, not awkward but reverent. "I've been thinking," he said finally, his voice low and clear. Clara turned toward him, her heart fluttering, though her face remained calm. About what Ilan reached into the pocket of his coat and drew out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a thin silver ring, its band etched with simple, swirling lines. He held it out between them, not as a question shouted to the sky, not as a claim to be made, but as an offering. "I don't ask you as someone who saved your life," he said. "I don't ask because we share a child. I ask as a man who has found peace in your presence, who sees you and knows you. Will you build this life with me? Not out of debt or obligation, but because it's what we both want." Clara looked at him, at the ring, and then at his face. His eyes held no demand, no fear, only trust. And love, deep and steady as riverstone. She nodded, her breath catching in her throat. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will." Ilan smiled, the corners of his eyes creasing. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit as if it had been waiting for that very place. She didn't cry, though her chest swelled with a feeling that made her eyes sting. Instead, she reached for his hand, and they stood there like that under the lanterns, beneath the stars, with nothing between them but truth. They didn't rush the wedding. There were no invitations, no carriages, no lace. Just a morning a few days later, where the sun rose over a quiet meadow not far from their home, and a small gathering of friends and neighbors joined in a circle around them. The preacher came, not in robe, but in his Sunday best, holding a worn Bible and a heart softened by all he had seen over the past year. Clara wore a pale blue dress, the same one she'd worn when she first brought Samuel into town. Ilan wore the same shirt from the night he proposed. Around her neck hung the tribal necklace he had once given her, its beads catching the morning light. There were flowers, wild ones gathered from the field that morning, tucked into her braid and wound around the edges of the table where bread and honey and cider had been laid out. Samuel toddled through the grass, giggling as children from the school followed him like ducklings. Clara looked out at the faces around them, the Abernathys, Miss Hollis, Garland, and even old Mr. Griggs, who now came weekly to deliver sacks of flour with a quiet smile. They stood together, not out of obligation, but because something real had taken root in this place. The vows were simple. Clara spoke first, her voice clear. "I don't promise you perfection, Ilan, but I promise honesty. I promise to stand beside you when the days are hard and to celebrate when they are good. I promise to remember who you are, even when the world forgets. And I promise to love this life we build together, stone by stone, breath by breath." Ilan's voice followed, steady and sure. "I promise to protect this home, not just with strength, but with gentleness. To raise our son with wisdom and wonder. I promise to respect your fire, your softness, your silence. And I promise that no matter what lies ahead, I will never walk away." The preacher nodded and declared them joined in the eyes of all who mattered this land. These people, And whatever power watched over the good and the brave, when Clara and Elin kissed, there was no cheering, no loud applause, just a quiet hum of joy, as if the trees themselves bent closer to witness it. Later, they sat together on the porch, the party fading behind them, Samuel curled up between them, the carved horse clutched in one hand, a piece of bread in the other. Elin took her hand, tracing the silver ring with his thumb. The necklace glinted on her collarbone, a symbol of beginnings, of survival, of the road they had traveled to reach this point. Clara looked out across the fields, where the children played in the tall grass, where neighbors lingered near fire pits, where the schoolhouse stood proud in the afternoon light. She leaned into Elan's shoulder and said, "This is what I hoped for, but I didn't know how to name it until now." He looked down at her, his eyes full of peace. "It's called belonging." She nodded, "And it's beautiful." And it was, not in the way stories often describe, with grand halls or jeweled veils, but in the way the earth feels when it's been tilled with love, in the way hands find each other in the dark, in the way a quiet life becomes a legacy. Their wedding was not the end of a story, but the beginning of something that would stretch far beyond the edge of their land, carried in laughter, in carved wood, in lanterns swaying under the stars. Snow fell gently over the roof of the small cabin nestled beside the edge of the pine woods, each flake catching the light from the lanterns glowing inside. Smoke curled steadily from the chimney, and within the wooden walls of the home, warmth thrived. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting shadows that danced across the floorboards worn smooth by time and love. Clara sat in a rocking chair near the fire, her knitting resting in her lap, though her hands had stopped working the needles some time ago. She was watching her son Nathaniel, now a boy of nearly 4, sprawled on the rug, humming softly as he lined up little carved animals across the floor. Elin sat nearby, polishing a wooden bowl with quiet care, the smell of beeswax mingling with the scent of pine logs burning. His face, once drawn by loss and silence, had softened with the years. Lines had settled around his eyes, not from worry, but from smiling. He looked up as Clara shifted in her seat, her gaze drawn toward the wall above the hearth. 3 names had been carved there, each with steady hands and deep intent. Clara, Nantan, Nathaniel. The carvings hadn't happened all at once. Nathaniel's came first, not long after he'd first taken a wobbly step across the floor, chasing after the carved horse Elin had made. Nantan's had followed soon after, when the school had officially opened its doors and townspeople stopped referring to him as the Apache and began using his name with respect. Clara's had come last, not out of hesitation but out of reverence. It had been Nathaniel who asked for it. "Where's your name, Mama?" he had said one morning, standing before the hearth with his thumb tucked in his mouth. Clara had smiled and knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his small frame. "I suppose it's time we put it there, too." And so Elin carved it, slowly, carefully, beside the others. Now the names stood together, not as labels, but as a testament. 3 lives once fractured, now bound by something stronger than blood. As the evening settled deeper and the wind sighed against the shutters, Nathaniel crawled into Clara's lap, wrapping his arms around her waist with the easy trust only a child carries. She kissed the top of his head, breathing in the scent of sun and cinnamon and wood smoke. "Tell me the story again," he whispered. "Which one?" she asked, rocking him slowly. "The one about the knock." Clara looked at Elin, who met her gaze with a faint smile. He set the bowl aside and moved to sit on the edge of the hearth, his long frame folding beside the fire. He reached for a stick and poked the embers, sending a few sparks dancing up the flue. Clara began, her voice gentle and steady. "It was winter, and the world was quiet. I had just finished supper and was cleaning up the dishes when I heard a knock on the door. It was soft, but it carried something I couldn't ignore. I opened the door, and there stood your father, holding you. You were just a baby, bundled in a blanket, your cheeks red from the cold. You looked like a snowball," Elin added, grinning. Nathaniel giggled and snuggled closer. "Your father didn't ask for much." Clara continued, Just milk, just a chance to save you. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw something more, something I didn't realize I'd been waiting for. I let you both in that night. And the world changed. Elan nodded. I thought I was asking for help, but what I found was a home. Nathaniel was quiet, eyes wide, soaking in the story he'd heard 100 times. It never grew old. To him, it was a fairy tale. To his parents, it was the miracle that rewrote their lives. I was afraid, Clara admitted softly. Afraid of what people would say. Afraid of being alone again. But I wasn't alone. Not after that night. And when they came for us, when the town tried to tear us apart, do you remember what your father said? Nathaniel nodded eagerly. You're my mother. And he's my father, Clara smiled. That's right. The fire popped, and for a moment, all three sat in silence, watching the flames twist and glow. Outside, snow continued to fall, coating the world in quiet. Inside, the warmth of the room held more than just heat. It held memory. It held the weight of choices made in faith, of days endured through strength, of laughter and learning and forgiveness. They had built their life plank by plank, hour by hour, each kindness layering over the last until the bitterness of their pasts faded into something softer. Not forgotten, but transformed. The judgment of the town had faded too, replaced by cautious respect, then quiet admiration. The school they started was now full of children from both settler and native families, their laughter echoing through the hills. It had become a place where history wasn't erased but rewritten with compassion. Nathaniel eventually drifted to sleep in Clara's arms. She rose gently, carrying him to his small bed beside the window, tucking the quilt around him and brushing his hair back with a mother's touch. When she returned to the fire, Elan stood waiting, his hand outstretched. They danced. No music, no words, just the creak of floorboards and the rhythm of a fire. Their movements were slow and imperfect, but each step was a reflection of everything they had endured and everything they had claimed as their own. When they stopped, Elan brushed her cheek with his knuckles and said, "This is the life I never thought I'd know." Clara leaned into him, resting her head against his chest. And it's only the beginning. The carved names above the hearth caught the flicker of firelight. Clara, Nantan, Nathaniel. A family forged not by tradition, not by blood, but by the courage to choose love when fear had been easier. And in that choice, they found not only each other but something eternal. A home, a legacy. A peace that would echo through generations long after the fire burned low. In a world often marked by division, fear, and past wounds, the story of Clara, Nantan, and Nathaniel reminds us of the healing power of compassion and the quiet strength found in choosing love over judgment. Their journey built not on blood but on courage, trust, and daily acts of kindness speaks to a truth many older Americans understand well. Family is not always about where you come from, but who you choose to stand beside. For those who have weathered life's hardships, lost loved ones, or felt isolated in changing times, this story offers a powerful message of redemption and belonging. It reminds us that it's never too late to open our hearts, that peace can be rebuilt from broken pieces, and that even the most unexpected bonds can become the foundation for something lasting and beautiful. In our later years, it's easy to believe that our most meaningful chapters are behind us, but this story gently says otherwise. Sometimes, life's deepest purpose arrives not with fanfare, but with a soft knock at the door and the decision to say yes to love one more time.